Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February the 29th, 1956, into a life that began with loss and was defined by abandonment. Her earliest years were shaped by parents who were ill-equipped to care for her, a young mother who left when Aileen was only 4, and a father who was in and out of prison and later took his own life. Left in the care of her grandparents in Florida, Aileen's childhood was starved of safety. She later claimed, and court records corroborated in part, that she suffered physical and sexual abuse in that household, that the environment she grew up in normalized violence and taught her to expect betrayal. By the time she was a teenager, the system meant to protect vulnerable children had failed her. Aileen dropped out of school, ran away, and began surviving any way she could, stealing, sleeping on the edges of towns, and trading sex for food or shelter. She learned to move quickly and to distrust almost everyone. Those early years established a pattern, a life of drifting, of fleeting attachments, of rage and fear braided together. She married briefly at 18, a marriage that ended almost as soon as it began. In the 1970s and 1980s, she drifted through the South and Midwest, arrested multiple times for petty crimes and for disorderly conduct. She used aliases and wore the camouflage of transients. Truck stops, bars, and rest areas were her geography. It was a life lived on the margins, where danger was constant and alliances were thin. In 1986, in Daytona Beach, Aileen met Tyria Moore. The relationship that followed was complicated and sometimes tender. 2 women trying to survive together in a harsh world. But it was also turbulent. Tyria later became a critical witness in the investigation into Aileen's killings, and their relationship would be dissected in courtrooms and media coverage for years. The woman who found in Tyria something like companionship would later become the center of one of the most notorious murder cases of late 20th century America. The crimes that would make Aileen Wuornos infamous began in late 1989. The first killing is generally dated to November 30th, 1989, when Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner, disappeared after being seen with Aileen. 2 weeks later, his body was found in a wooded area outside Daytona Beach. He had been shot several times with a small caliber handgun. Aileen's later claims about Mallory were complicated. She would tell interviewers and the police that Mallory had been violent toward her, that he had tried to rape and sodomize her, and that she had shot him in self-defense. Others, who later investigated Mallory's past, would discover criminal convictions for sexual offenses that complicated the narrative. But the evidence would never fully vindicate Aileen's version of events. Over the next 12 months, more bodies appeared in Florida's woods and along its highways. David Spears, Charles Cascadden, Troy Burris, Charles Dick Humphreys, Peter Seams, and Walter Antonio, men of different ages and backgrounds, were each found dead, each shot by a .22 caliber weapon, and each tied, in the minds of investigators, to a pattern. Several were found unclothed, in secluded stretches of roadway. Others were discovered near abandoned vehicles. The similarities in the wounds and the weaponry led detectives to conclude that a single killer or killer pair was responsible. Each killing carried its own context and detail, small facts that would later fill pages of police reports and court transcripts. David Spears, a construction worker, was discovered naked and shot 6 times along State Road 19. Charles Cascadden, later identified as a part-time rodeo worker, was found wrapped in an electric blanket and riddled with bullets. Witnesses had seen his car in the possession of two women. Troy Burress, on a delivery route, disappeared and was later located in the woods. His wallet and some personal effects were missing. Walter Antonio, a truck driver and reserve police officer, was found nearly naked on a logging road. His body shot multiple times, and his vehicle later located abandoned in a different county. Forensic links, ballistics, pawnshop records, and witness statements began to stitch the deaths together into a single thread. The investigation moved slowly at first. Florida law enforcement in the late 1980s and early 1990s had to coordinate across counties and agencies, and a nomadic killer operating along highways complicated the job. But the pattern was brutal in its efficiency. Men who picked up a woman or solicited sex vanished. Vehicles were found abandoned, personal items turned up in pawn shops or in the possession of people who had no right to them. Small details became crucial. Handprints on car doors, a partial license plate, a pawn slip bearing an alias. These tiny pieces of paper and smudged prints would eventually break the case open. There were moments during the investigation when the trail nearly went cold, and moments when chance and human error intersected to reveal the truth. A crashed vehicle near Orange Springs in July 1990 provided one such break. Witnesses who saw the occupants fleeing the scene would later identify Aileen and Tyria. Fingerprints and the abandonment of a car in connection to one of the victims tied two women to an outline of crimes across central Florida. When detectives began to focus on Aileen Wuornos, a picture emerged of a woman who carried weapons, who kept company with a younger partner, and who pawned property in the days after the disappearances. Witnesses at bars and motels placed her with several of the victims. Pawnshop records showed transactions made under false names. Each small piece strengthened the case. There was motive beyond self-defense, suggested by prosecutors. Opportunistic robbery, a pattern of lashing out when a relationship soured, and a simmering fury in Aileen toward men who, in her telling or in their actions, represented threat. The tactical operation that led to Aileen's arrest was, at first, unglamorous. On January 9th, 1991, at the last resort, a biker bar, undercover officers and deputies were waiting with warrants and questions. Aileen, appearing disheveled and exhausted from life on the road, was arrested without resistance. Her companion, Tyria Moore, was taken into custody as well. Within days, Tyria had agreed to cooperate with investigators. She would wear a wire and make calls designed to elicit incriminating admissions from Aileen. What came from those controlled interactions was a body of confession that would dominate public perception. Aileen, speaking in her raw, unfiltered voice, made statements about each killing, claiming self-defense in some, offering contradictory explanations in others. The confession tapes and recorded conversations were complicated. They were both evidentiary and performative, often swinging between claim and blame, between contrition and defiance. Prosecutors played the tapes to show a woman who, in their view, killed for gain, and who had no legitimate claim of self-defense in multiple cases. Defense attorneys argued that the confessions were the ramblings of a damaged woman, that trauma and mental illness distorted both memory and narrative. At trial, the prosecution constructed a sequence. Aileen asked for sex. The men agreed. She killed them with a .22 caliber handgun, and she took or sold property to support herself. The defense responded with another sequence. Aileen endured violence. She defended herself, and her life prior to the crimes explained a pattern of hypervigilance and fear. Jurors were asked to weigh competing pictures. A survivalist who was victimized repeatedly and lashed out, and a violent predator who exploited sexual encounters for financial gain. The court records are full of the back and forth. Witness testimony about sightings, forensic testimony about bullets and pawn slips, psychological testimony about the defendant's battered mind. Psychologists who evaluated Aileen presented a complex diagnosis. Multiple defense experts testified to borderline personality disorder, with features of post-traumatic stress and severe emotional disturbance. A mind shaped by early sexual abuse, chronic neglect, and decades of violence. Other psychiatric professionals emphasized that, regardless of trauma, Aileen had capacity. She could form intent and calculate. The legal standard for criminal responsibility required jurors to apply both medical testimony and common-sense judgment. In the end, juries convicted Aileen Wuornos of multiple counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death for 6 of the killings. The trial was a media firestorm. A female serial killer was itself a tabloid phenomenon. The press seized on images and sound bites that alternately humanized and demonized her. Documentaries, cable news segments, and sensational talk shows replayed clips of the confession tapes and interviewed acquaintances who spoke of her charm, her danger, and her past. The courtroom became a stage where narratives about gender, violence, and victimhood were contested in public. Aileen's time on death row was marked by erratic behavior and, at times, moments of clarity. Prison records and interviews with guards reveal a woman who could oscillate between lucidity and delusion. She wrote letters, spoke of visions, and sometimes seemed to embrace the identity that the media had given her. The monstrous icon, as if that was safer than returning to a life without notoriety. Toward the end of her appeals, she dismissed her lawyers and insisted on proceeding without further legal challenge. Her choice, some jurists feared, was not a rational legal decision, but a sign of her deteriorated mental state. Nevertheless, the state set an execution date. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida. She was 46. In the weeks and months before her death, debates about her culpability, about the fairness of her trial, and about the role trauma played in shaping her behavior intensified. Advocates argued that a woman so malnourished by early life experience could not be fairly judged by ordinary standards. Prosecutors and many victims' families insisted the jury had done its duty. Her last statements were rambling and apocalyptic to some. To others, they were the final echo of a life that had never known stability. In the years since Aileen's execution, her story has been retold, reinterpreted, and mythologized. The film Monster gave her a tragic human face. Documentaries alternately sympathized and condemned. Feminist scholars debated whether she was a symbol of a system that created monsters out of victims, or whether she was a manipulative killer who weaponized her suffering. Cultural critics asked why a woman's violence prompts different questions than a man's. How do gender expectations change how we read motive, responsibility, and cruelty? The minutiae of the killings, the pawn slips, the .22 caliber ballistics, the cars abandoned on country roads, the witness sightings at bars, matter because they are a map of how law enforcement pieced together the case. They are also a map of a life lived in transaction. Sex for shelter, sex for money, sex for survival. Aileen's method was not sophisticated. It was a blunt instrument attached to a fragile, damaged body. That bluntness is part of what made her crimes both terrifying and compelling. They were close, personal, and messy in a way that magnified the horror. There remains no tidy morale answer to the question of Aileen Wuornos. In one sense, she was an agent, capable of choosing and executing violence. In another, she was an instrument of a sequence of harms that began long before she ever picked up a gun. The failures of family, the indifference of institutions, the invisible erosion of a person's capacity to cope. For victims' families, the answer is simple and raw. A life was taken, and grieving remains. For historians and psychologists, the case is a study in how trauma and criminality intersect. If we examine the evidence and the record without the intoxication of sensationalism, what remains is a stark portrait of desperate survival that sometimes looked like revenge. Aileen's own words were inconsistent, but they reflected a life of perceived betrayal. She claimed self-defense, sometimes with details that bore internal consistency, and at other times with contradictions that undermined her credibility. The jury had to choose between the sympathetic portrait painted by psychiatrists and the objective forensic trail offered by prosecutors. Their choice was death sentences in 6 cases, life for the 7th where the body was never recovered. Finally, the legacy of the case is not only legal or cultural, it is also personal. There are the victims, their families, people who carried the consequences of those deaths into their everyday lives. There is Tyria Moore, who lived with the knowledge that she had been beside a woman who killed and later agreed to cooperate with investigators. There are the activists and the scholars who view the case as a cautionary tale about how society fails people and then punishes them for failing to survive. Aileen Wuornos is still a figure who resists simple labels. In the public imagination, she is both cautionary and monstrous, pitiable and terrifying. The highways where she killed are quieter now, but the questions she raises about how violence and neglect breed one another persist. She remains a study in the ways trauma can calcify a life, in the ways institutions can break or fail to protect, and in the raw consequences that follow when a person who has known nothing but abandonment decides to take control of fate with a weapon. This account has tried to walk the narrow line between explanation and excuse. We can explain the forces that shaped Aileen Wuornos without excusing the actions she chose. We can study the forensic evidence, the legal record, and the psychiatric testimony. And we must also remember the human toll, the lives taken, and the life that ended on death row. In the paradox of the case, there is a warning and a challenge. To see how cycles of abuse perpetuate, and to ask how society might prevent such cycles from continuing. Thank you for listening. If this documentary raised questions for you, leave them in the comments below. Subscribe for more long-form investigations into true crime cases that force us to confront the darkest corners of the human story.